So, hello everyone. I'm going to give this talk in English, and I want to start by apologizing to the previous panel. This is me experimenting with GIFs, and I obviously couldn't plan that Donald Trump would be pointing right at the panel and following it. So my apologies for that. So, my name is Maximilian Conrad. I am a professor at the Faculty of Political Science at the University of Iceland. And my research addresses questions that are in a way quite connected to what is being talked about here in this conference. Questions connected to themes like democracy, political communication, citizenship, the public sphere, kind of in that ballpark. For the last few years, I've also been the leader or academic coordinator of an international research network funded by the European Union, so-called Jean Monnet Network, which is made up of partners at 6 universities in 6 different countries, 5 in Europe, 1 in Canada. And the purpose of that network is to study the theme of post-truth politics, nationalism, and what we call delegitimation of European integration. So it's basically about the impact of this phenomenon of post-truth politics on, well, democracy and the European Union. My talk today has the title Post-Truth Politics and the Populist Challenge to Media Freedom. And as you can see from the title, I will not talk exclusively about issues of trust in public institutions. But I still think that this talk here provides a hopefully relevant angle, and therefore I think also fits in quite well with the overarching ambitions of the conference. So thanks a lot to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak here. So basically the talk is about the connection between populism on the one hand and a problem that I, alongside many other academics but also journalists, consider to be a fundamental challenge to liberal democracy as we understand it. And that is, on the one hand, the gradual decline of quality journalism that we've seen for at least a decade or so, probably longer, which has its own reasons, which we're not going to have time to go into here. But then on the other hand, also the accompanying gradual decline of trust in mainstream, professional, traditional, legacy journalism, whichever label you want to apply here. And the talk that I'm giving will contextualize this problem, that is, the connection between populism and the decline of trust in quality journalism, by discussing it in connection with this phenomenon that we call post-truth politics, and what this phenomenon might mean for the future of liberal democracy here in Europe or elsewhere, actually. Now, many, if not most of you, have probably heard of this phenomenon of post-truth politics before. I mean, it's become an enormously popular concept, kind of a buzzword of sorts. And of course, I mean, as is often the case with this type of buzzword, it's also hotly debated. There are people that, claim that we live in an age of post-truth politics, whereas there's also a number of scholars that are critical of our use of this concept. So I feel the need that I need to explain a bit what but also what a lot of other researchers, especially in our network, mean by this. So basically, I mean, to put it in as simple terms as possible, I would say that post-truth politics refers to a specific way of doing politics. Specifically a way of doing politics in which the truth isn't, or at least doesn't seem to be, particularly relevant any longer. And I'm saying doesn't seem to be particularly relevant because this is a pretty big statement. The truth isn't relevant in politics anymore. So it's something that we certainly need to discuss quite a bit further, which I will do in the course of this talk. Now, a lot of this has to do with Donald Trump. As I guess is abundantly clear by now. I mean, you can say that post-truth politics is when politicians like Donald Trump don't know the facts or lie about the facts. But more importantly, I mean, that's an important point to me, it is when this doesn't seem to bother his followers or the followers of other politicians who engage in this kind of politics, while the rest of us may shake our heads in disbelief. So let's take this very simple idea as a starting point. And then if you look at the development of this phenomenon of post-truth politics, then you see, well, it's something that we've seen maybe for a few years, but especially since the year 2016. And 2016 was what you might call a watershed year for post-truth politics. As a matter of fact, that year, 2016, the word post-truth was so popular that it became the word of the year in the Oxford English Dictionary. Now, if you think back to that time, and again, I'm probably making it quite clear by putting these two pictures up here. Now, if you think back to that time, you will probably also be able to say why that word was so popular exactly that year. And it is because, of course, there were two major events that happened that year that really drove home the point that there is something that's going on, something that we need to look at and that we need to understand better. The one was the Brexit referendum, with this famous claim: if we leave the European Union, then we're going to be able to send 350 million pounds a week back to the NHS or something like this. And then, of course, also the Trump campaign. So, I mean, these two events that I'm referring to are Brexit and the election of Donald Trump as US president. Of course, I mean, then you ask, why did these events result in making this concept of post-truth or post-truth politics so popular? Well, simply put, because both the Leave campaign in the UK, as illustrated by this bus, and the Trump campaign in the US were so rife with mis- and disinformation. And we're making this distinction between mis- and disinformation to say that you can say something that is factually wrong without knowing it, or you can do it deliberately, strategically, knowing that what you're saying to people is wrong, but you're still saying it because it will have a certain political effect. A lot of books and articles have been published on this phenomenon since then, since 2016. And one common theme in them has been that one characteristic trait of this post-truth era is that in terms of its relevance in politics and political debates, the truth does appear to be losing ground to something else. And I leave that a bit as an open question, what that something else is. But very often that something is identified as emotion. So basically that we're saying that the truth or factual correctness doesn't matter as much anymore as appeals to emotion. But like I said, I mean, I'm leaving that bit open because I think that's another relatively big question that we need to look at in more detail. This idea that the truth is replaced or is losing ground to emotion in politics. I mean, this is very close to the definition that the Oxford English Dictionary also offers. There, post-truth is defined as, and I quote, relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. This may, however, be a fairly problematic way of looking at things. If truth is replaced with emotion, and by emotion we usually mean, I mean, even though we say more abstractly emotion, we usually refer to anger. If we do this, if we replace truth with emotion, then of course we will need to ask what that emotion is directed towards, what that anger is directed towards. And I think that also connects to the discussion that we had before the break. I mean, what do we do about populism? I think this is one of the things we need to ask. I mean, if there is frustration or anger that is taking the place of the truth or whatever you want to call that, then we certainly need to know what that's about, basically. But regardless of this, we are seeing what my colleague Saul Newman, whom I'm working with in this Jean Monnet network, describes as the loss of, and I quote, the symbolic authority of the truth, end quote. This shows us that we're basically talking about a transformation or at least a development in political culture. That is, it used to be the case that one of the more embarrassing things that could happen to a politician would be to be mistaken about the facts, for the simple reason that that would make this person seem uneducated, ill-prepared, possibly ignorant, and it would certainly cast doubts on their ability to perform in office. But is this still the case? think for a moment about what it might mean to live in a society where facts are seen as no more relevant than emotions. I should say that I look at facts as something objective to the extent that they are based on epistemologically reliable methods. Think about gravity. I mean, I could drop something on the floor and you would be able to do the same thing, and the same thing would happen every time. I mean, that would be something that I would consider to be an epistemologically reliable method, because we can replicate it and we can say with certainty, if I throw something in the air, it's going to fall down because of gravity. What would it be like to live in a society where facts are no more important than opinions or emotions? Or, if you go one step further, where no facts are considered objective any longer, and are therefore viewed as one type of subjective opinion among many others? What would that do to the idea of democracy? Or what would it do to the idea that democracy is about elections, but significantly also about participation and deliberation, about exchanging arguments in the public sphere? How would any of that be possible without the acceptance of objective facts? On the basis of what would you be deliberating with other people? This brings me to Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt, the famous political philosopher, looked at this as basically the most basic requirement for not democracy, but for politics as such. Because politics is essentially about different views and interpretations of the facts. And obviously what you make of the facts is a highly subjective thing. What you think the state or government or any political actor should do in terms of policy making, for instance, is also highly subjective. But it still, which is what Hannah Arendt is telling us, requires a shared basis in facts. Now, how is all this connected to the themes of this conference? Well, the phenomenon of post-truth politics is intimately connected to populism, possibly with the qualification right-wing populism. If you think of figures like Donald Trump in the US, Nigel Farage in the UK, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, I could name quite a few examples from almost any country that comes to mind. And they have certain things in common, obviously. And we're talking about a brand of populist politician that, and that's a key point, that exploits a political culture where anger and frustration easily seem to trump truth and factual correctness. I'm aware of the pun, it's not intended, but anyways. So we're talking about politicians that exploit this specific political culture, but this is also a brand of populist politician that in doing so contributes to and fuels the phenomenon. And it does so in no insignificant part by promoting, not only drawing on, but also promoting distrust in the institution of journalism. And this conference addresses issues of trust in public institutions, and we can say with safety that distrust in journalism is directed to no insignificant part also towards public service journalism, where it still exists at least. The empirical references that I'm going to make, they don't necessarily come from Iceland. But if you like Bert Brecht the way I do, then you probably see that, you know, the things that I'm describing, even though they're from a different setting, might also apply in some ways to Iceland. But I'll leave that up to your interpretation. I'm just making observations about other settings. So keep in mind how Donald Trump used to try to discredit critical journalists by calling them fake news, just like, you know, we saw just before. And this is a development that is, of course, quite closely connected with Donald Trump, but it certainly did not start with him, and it's certainly not limited to him. If I think back about 10 years, or maybe a little less actually, to the Eastern German context, where the Pegida marches started, have actually continued until this day, protesting the alleged Islamization of the West since 2014. They have also been characterized by a very fervent rejection of mainstream and public service journalism. So journalists that were covering these marches were frequently taunted, or actually I should say are, because this is still going on, are frequently taunted as liar press. spreading lies, basically distorting the truth, giving a different account of what is actually happening. And this is something that you can also see in the context of the COVID pandemic, where journalists are also portrayed as enemies of the people. And you see here, well, actually you don't see it so well. This is from a recent protest against COVID restrictions in Germany. And you see that people are holding up signs with individuals in prisoners' clothing, basically claiming that they should go to prison. Most of them are politicians. Well, one is actually also a leading journalist. Yeah, I guess difficult to show, but I mean, this is basically the point, that also in the context of COVID, the journalists are withholding the truth or aren't telling the truth as it is, and therefore they should go to prison. Which of course then also draws, I mean, there's also a parallel to the Trump campaign and lock Hillary Clinton up and things like this. And in fact, well, I would argue that it is absolutely striking and fascinating and also clear to see how the same hostility to journalists plays out at different times and in relation to different issues. Whether it's COVID, whether it's the Pegida marches, whether it's the US presidential campaign, or other contexts. So in Germany, and in particular in the 5 Eastern states, which used to be the former German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, resistance against COVID measures has been particularly fierce. And so has been resistance against vaccination campaigns. And this shows, on the one hand, a rejection of all the scientific evidence that supports contact restrictions as well as vaccinations. But, and I think that's the striking point, it also shows the increasing significance of a post-truth paradigm. And as part of it, an increasing hostility to what I consider to be one of the central pillars in any democratic public sphere, namely the institution of journalism. These are 2 campaign posters from the Alternative for Germany that highlight this quite well and highlight the way this sentiment is being exploited by right-wing populist actors. So again, in Germany, one of the campaign issues of the Alternative for Germany, unsurprisingly you might say, targets the funding system of public service broadcasting. Public service broadcasting in Germany is funded by mandatory fees, and the AfD, unsurprisingly, wants to get rid of these fees. In fact, it frames the existence of public service journalism as an infringement of citizens' rights. Basically, this notion, freier Funk für freie Bürger, free broadcasting for free citizens, is not, as you might think, a support of public service journalism. It's the opposite. It is basically the claim that the organization that collects, the authority that collects broadcasting fees should be abolished. So basically telling that the press system and the public broadcasting system that we have in this country is not free. It's the opposite of it. So consequently, it demands the abolition of this organization. And needless to say, this is then also a highly salient issue for voters who already believe that they are being lied to by the mass media. But of course, the much bigger question is, how did we end up here? How is it possible that the truth is losing its status in political culture, if that is the case? Leaving that open. How can it be that emotion is increasingly seen as more important than factual correctness? Is there a deeper problem that we're not taking seriously enough? I have alluded to one problem that may very well suggest that it isn't actually the truth that is losing status or its symbolic authority. And we need to be very careful not to let, for instance, the blatant lies of Donald Trump distract us from what might be potentially much bigger issues. The fact that there is a considerable distrust in traditional media institutions, and in particular that there is a considerable segment of the population across countries that feels that they are not being told the truth, that has to tell us something. Could it be, at least at some level, that the truth still has a value after all? What may explain the success of populist politicians isn't necessarily that their voters don't care about the truth per se, even though that's what we often talk about. Instead, it is entirely plausible to consider that they feel that the other parties aren't telling them the truth either. And I mean, I think we've seen this from these campaign posters that I've shown. But more importantly, they may feel that there are aspects of the truth that quite simply aren't addressed at all, at least not by mainstream parties, which fuels anger and therefore makes it appear as if emotion were more important than the facts. It might surprise you to hear this from someone that spends a lot of time thinking about what post-truth politics means for democracy, citizenship, the public sphere, and things like this. And obviously, this shouldn't be seen as downplaying the threat of post-truth politics or of populism. It's actually quite the contrary. But it does point in the direction of an argument that is prominently made by another one of my colleagues from our network, Jon Erik Fossum in Oslo. He sees post-truth politics predominantly as a symptom, not as the disease itself, but a symptom of a much deeper problem. And he thinks this has to do with changing policy configurations. And what he means by this is the idea that policy is, well, actually politics in the sense of what we're doing here, or public debates, elections, parliaments, and things like this. That's something that still happens at the national or subnational level. But policy making plays out increasingly in other forms, at the supranational or at the international level, sorry. And this is something, well, actually one of the reasons why Donald Trump won the 2016 elections, and you might have seen this prediction by Michael Moore. Michael Moore, the filmmaker, predicted in early 2016 that Donald Trump would win the election, because he accurately predicted that he would swing the four previously Democratic states, Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, which was largely due to unemployment, which was caused by the North American Free Trade Association. And it is such changing policy configurations that provide a fertile ground for the emergence of populist politicians and then also for post-truth politics. But this talk is primarily about post-truth politics and the populist challenge to media freedom. My point in that regard is that populism, as we've seen it in the post-truth era, is deeply problematic because it frames quality journalism as part of the problem. That brings us back to theorizing about populism. Populist politicians operate on the basis of a narrative of a usually corrupt liberal elite conspiring and acting against the will and interests of the people, the real people. The mass media are construed as part of this corrupt elite that fails to tell people the truth. And Trump's fake news allegations are certainly only the tip of the iceberg here. We may find them laughable, but they are an indication of a severe problem. Simply because we see a pattern among populist politicians. So this narrative of the mass media as part of the corrupt liberal elite serves to delegitimize the institution of journalism. Consequently, this narrative is then also closely linked to claims about defunding public service journalism. This would, however, have severe consequences for any democratic society. This is why it's so important, as I've done in this talk, to spell out the connection between populism, the delegitimation of public service journalism, and its consequences for media freedom. So I think it's essential to have this kind of conversation and to find ways to enhance trust in the institution of journalism and see the value and indispensable role of independent journalism in any democratic society. Thank you.